All right. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate it. Aloha from Kentucky for all of you folks out there. My name is David Bolton, and as advertised, I'm a learning activist. And for what that means is that I'm kind of an activist in the sense that I want to change how people behave and think with respect to learning. More on that as we proceed. I'm delighted to be here. I'm honored to be here. I think this is a fantastic cause. And again, I think Mike and Dustin and Jessica and the whole team at Step by Step have done a fantastic service to the world, to the community, to all of us who care about kids and learning to read in particular. Before we proceed, I'd like to lay some caveats down. First of all, I don't mean to insult anybody's intelligence. Because of the nature of these kind of events, you have to make certain assumptions about the quality and the experience of the different people that are listening. So I'm going to do my best to try to make a path through the generalizations that are necessary in this kind of environment without any intent to be insulting anybody's intelligence if I'm oversimplistic or overgeneralized. I also don't mean to be blaming or shaming anybody. Some of what I'm going to say is going to be controversial. It's going to be difficult in that it's almost heretical in some respects with respect to what a lot of people think about reading. But that said, I think that everybody's work and the place they come from is they try to help children through this gauntlet of orthographic confusion and up into reading mastery. Everybody's work is coming from a good place, and I don't mean to be blaming or shaming anybody for the problems. The problems that we face today with reading in this country and around the world in the English orthography and the English language is a consequence of a historical trajectory that's been going on for hundreds of years. It's not new. And in that sense, none of us are to blame for what's going wrong, and all of us are responsible for trying to change and improve things. Finally, there's no sales pitch going on here. I work for a nonprofit organization, and the nonprofit organization has a series of resources in the form of instructional videos, which I'm going to show you a bit about, and a series of technology tools. All of them are free. All of them you can do whatever you want with. So I'm not trying to sell anybody here, nor am I trying to con or persuade you into thinking differently. Rather, to take you on a guided tour of how to think about all of this in a different way, in a hopefully different way. So I mentioned earlier that I've been involved in this for a while. 15 plus years ago, I began a project called Children of the Code. We called it Children of the Code for a couple of reasons. One, because we're all children of the code, like we're all children of the DNA code. We're all children of the ABC code. We're all children of the ABC code because no technology in the entire history of history has had more effect on the world and every aspect of the world we live in today than this code we use to read and write with. And no technology has had more effect on our minds and how our minds participate and learn into the world and manipulate the science and technology of the world than this code. This code, in fact, is the most significant invention in the entire history of history. So that's one sense of where Children of the Code came from. The other side of it, and the one that's more heartful and the one that's actually the more important, is that the great number of children, arguably the majority of our kids, have their lives all but faded, warped, mangled, distorted because of the collateral damage they experience to their sense of themselves, their belief in their capacity to learn, as a consequence of the difficulty they experience learning to read. So I'm going to come back to this a couple of different times to revisit this Children of the Code process, this documentary, and some of the things that we learned from it. For right now, I just want to say, over the course of this project, some 15 years ago, we interviewed virtually, in fact, the people at the Department of Education called it the who's who of reading science and policy. So the people in Washington that set the policy for reading that exists to this day, the researchers who formed the conclusions about reading or the hypothesis about reading from a neuroscience, psychological, linguistic, instructional, every dimension of reading research. Neurocognitive science, the people that were studying the brain and that are studying the brain to this day, that are teased out how the brain represents phonemes, for example, and the phonological loop and various aspects of neurocognitive processing. We talked to the people that were involved in language, both from a point of view of how language evolved in humanity over time, how humanity adapted to being language users, and how all that created a backdrop for the emergence of reading and how reading relates to language. So across the board on that. Early childhood development, from Jack Shonkoff and others who were pioneers in our understanding of the early childhood neuroscience, how the brain boots itself up, so to speak, all the way through people involved in the dyslexia, the head of the dyslexia organizations, Nancy Shaywitz, et cetera, a number of folks across the spectrum of learning disabilities and the various organizations that are out there in the country that deal with problems related to learning disabilities, dyslexia, reading problems, literacy organizations like pro-literacy, literacy organizations like National Center for Family Literacy. So our point was we're trying to gather the expertise. Over 100 of the leaders in the country and some parts around the world, Israel and Canada, and over 1,000 hours of in-depth conversations. These also included the origins of the code. So from scratching on bones, from the beginnings of writing, from the beginnings of recorded records of transactions, all the way up through the early forms of writing that preceded the alphabet, then through the alphabet's big bang and how the alphabet spread around the world and how the alphabet changed the way that we speak and listen to oral language. So the entire history of that. And then finally, how the alphabet and the English sound system merged together to become the reading environment that we have to teach kids to learn to read with today, and the efforts that have gone on over the past few hundred years to try to improve that. In the entirety of this whole scope, this 1,000 hours of conversations, you could boil it down in some respects to these 4 points.
The problem is our society's lack of insight into what is involved in acquiring literacy.
So when we think we're going to fix the reading problem in the country by teaching beginning reading in a particular way, we're fooling ourselves.
If I had my druthers, instructional methods wouldn't be the big deal out there. What would be the big deal is if teachers could ask themselves, what does it take to learn to read?
We need to reconceptualize what it means to learn to read, who's responsible for its success if we're going to deal with the problem.
As we proceed, I will give you links to go back to Children of the Code. There's 130 videos that cover all of those different topics and more than I was just skimming over a moment ago that you can use for in your professional development work, in your schools, and a lot of kids benefit from them because it also talks about their experiences. A lot of kids interviewed. So the reason I share those previous 4 clips is that kind of captured it. That what the people that were sitting on top of the pyramid, so to speak, that were looking at the mountain of science and research and data about what's going on in this country and all of its collateral costs and effects, both to the psychology and well-being of individuals, but in the aggregate to the costs and effects on society. What they're basically saying is that everybody thinks they understand reading, and yet very few people really understand reading. And it is the misperceptions we have, the quickness to jump to thinking about reading through the lens of how we teach it rather than trying to understand it apart from how we teach it, that has caused so much confusion. So we started with this question. Have you ever asked yourself this? How is it that these words, when my eyes look at words on a screen or a piece of paper, how is it that I hear them or experience their meaning or experience their recognition instantly in my mind? I mean, how does that happen? What's involved in that? It's a separate question than how to teach it, which we'll come back to. One of the things that we discovered in the Children of the Code, which is going to be the pivot point for the whole talk today, is the degree to which the entirety of our science and understanding and the understanding of the neuroscience, the cognitive science, the instructional science, particularly the instructional science, everything about what we currently think about the science of learning to read is based on a series of assumptions. These assumptions are the reason in my view, and I'm going to unpack this as we go, why we've been flatlined for so long. As you all know, at least I think you know, the vast majority of everybody that has studied this has basically come to the conclusion that for as long as we've been keeping data, we've been pretty much flatlined. So you can go back to periods in time earlier in the 20th century where it seemed like literacy was better, but it's because we weren't measuring as well, right? It's like so many other things, the better we get at measuring, the more that it reveals certain things. So, but even in the case of NAEP, which has been, you know, nearly 30 years of keeping track of data that we feel reasonably reliable we feel is reasonably reliable, we've seen basically a flat line. Almost 2/3 of the kids in this country are chronically not good enough at reading, right? So from the time they come in and we first start to assess them till the time they leave, the majority of kids are below proficiency. And I want to say again that I think the biggest single cause for this is an unchallenged assumption, which is going to be the heart of my talk today. This assumption that I'm talking about runs through, whoops.
Reading a new word is really hard.
My brain hurt. Brain started hurting. It's like it kept on boop, boop, boop. I can't understand what it's saying. I kept on getting mixed up with words. It makes my heart drop. It made me feel kind of scared that I'm not smart.
I remember feeling pretty dumb.
Middle school came with the bigger words. I was like, wow.
The words that, like, when you sign them out, they aren't pronounced the way they sound.
After I got done, man, you can't read or nothing. I thought you was smart.
Ever since then, I've been comfortable reading in front of people, and they made fun of me and stuff, so I just never really liked to read after that.
And I wasn't able to read since the 3rd grade.
My grades kind of started slipping a lot. I just decided, you know, I'm not a good reader. There's no hope for me.
Always felt, you know, stupid.
Society don't want you because you can't read. That's just the way I feel. I'm just an outcast to the whole world. You know, like a waste of breath. You know, just being here.
So this same assumption that I'm talking about underlies this whole thing. From virtually everything that's being discussed at this conference, science of reading, insights into scientific research, comprehension, instructional levels, whether to level, how to level, how to develop comprehension strategies, the critical dependence on vocabulary, how we approach ELA, how we approach ESL, how we approach and think about fluency. All of these different dimensions are an outgrowth of a common assumption I really want to challenge. Again, without blame. Now, before I do this, let me give you a sense of where I come from coming into this conversation, coming into the work that I've done at Children of the Code and previous, and what the things that I'm going to do today and that I do today and that I'll share with you today. So back in the late 70s, I was the president of a robotics company, and we built the machines that made the initial disks that made the personal computers possible. So I was involved in the early stages of the personal computer. For a number of reasons, I became very interested in learning, and I went on what I would call a learning binge, during the course of which I came to realize the most important thing was that any person could learn, just about any person could learn just about anything if who or what they were learning from could meet them on the edge of their learning with what they needed. And the more that I realized that, the more that the world seemed really out of whack. And that led me off in a new direction in which I developed an electronic book, one of the world's first electronic books. This is mid 80s. In the course of the time of this getting exposed in the Silicon Valley area, Apple Computer approached me, and I developed a multi-year working relationship with Apple that led me to become their keynote speaker for the Future of Learning talks. So I would be just going around the country and Canada, Mexico, other places in the world, basically presenting to VIPs of Apple's choosing, international and national, who they were doing large-scale marketing to craft a vision about what learning was going to be like in the future. And so I did these talks virtually all over the country for them. That led to me being involved in the work at the California and National Education Summits. I wrote a number of articles and papers on learning and learning sciences. My work, though I was always focused and most concerned about the children, at Apple, I got applied, my models got applied to do the design of the electronic campus, the first virtual university used as a desktop support system for the employees of Apple Computer. So here I am, this is early 1990s, and I'm deeply involved in learning sciences, meeting with learning scientists, dialogue with people involved in learning science in different parts of the country and world, writing, working on technology projects, etc. And you could say that in some respects, I was coming from trying to manifest what Da Vinci said so many hundreds of years ago, that learning is the only thing that will never fail us. That was where I was coming from, right? Like I had come to realize that learning was the central dynamic of everything. Everything that we have any control over, anything that we have any choice over, anything that we have any effect over, we have choice and effect because of learning, right? We become who we learn to become. It's not just an ancillary mental utility for the acquisition of knowledge and skills. Learning is the central dynamic of just about everything about us. Not the color of our eyes, but certainly how we see with our eyes, what we see with our eyes. Not our emotions, in the sense that we all can get angry, but what we get angry about and how we learn to manage them. Not what we eat, but our eating habits, right? So across the board, we are who we learn to be. That led me to a realization, which is the center of my work even today, that nothing is more important to our children's futures than how well they can learn when they get there, right? There's nothing we have to teach kids that's more important than how well they can learn. Everything we think that's important for kids to learn is at best scaffolding for exercising their capacity to learn beyond whatever we're teaching them at any given time. Even back then, I'd come to realize that the most precious resource on the planet, given no matter what your issue was, whether you're concerned with gender equality or the environment or / global warming, or you're concerned with politics or whatever the problem you were most concerned about the unfolding nature of human reality, the most precious resource in any long view was how well children learn. That led me to think that we've kind of had it backwards. At least we've come to a point in time where we have to realize that we've had it backwards. Historically, it was fine for the adults of humanity to treat the children of humanity as replicants, as the purpose of the adult was to teach the child to replace the adult. And everything about education was pretty much organized around that, as was parenting for the longest time. But we've now come to a point where the rate of change, the complexity of change, everything that's going on at such rapid rates that has such massive implications for everybody. We're all interconnected, as the COVID thing has demonstrated very vividly for us all now, is that nothing's more important than how well they can learn. And so that we have to do this kind of flip from being oriented around knowledge, skills, and experience being the end goal, and start to think of knowledge, skills, and experience as the exercise environment, and the end goal being how well they can learn and participate. Now, thank you for indulging that little offshoot, which is still the center of my work, but I want to come back now and say, while of course I was developing this, while working at Apple, I was also involved at MIT's Organizational Learning Center at the Dialogue Research Project. During the course of this work on learning, both individually and collectively, while that was going on, my kids drug me by the heart and by the head to reading. So I hadn't given reading a thought. I hadn't given it any consideration. I just assumed it. I was on the other side of it myself. I just assumed all of the technology I was working on at Apple, all of the stuff I was working on with what I called the learner interface and the electronic book and the publishing systems I was involved, all of that stuff assumed somebody could read. I have to say that before I go on to this next part, I regret that in many respects that I was kind of asleep at the switch with my first two kids. I have 4 kids. With my first 2 kids, I didn't pay much attention to them coming up through school at the reading junction. And so fortunately, they took off into reading and it wasn't their problem. In 1990, while still working at Apple, I had a son who had according to his kindergarten teacher, the vocabulary of a 20-year-old. He was off scale, verbally dexterous, bright.
Tyler, I think you'll be impressed with this.
I don't know how to work this.
Oh.
He grew up playing with computers, and he grew up trusting his capacity to learn. And yet he came home from school one day with a book in his hand. And he said, "Hey, Dad, come here." And he pointed to a word in the book. And he said, "It can't be that way. It just can't be that way." So he'd grown up thinking things may be outside his scope. He may not be able to understand something at any given point, right? Something like in a computer game, like there's something that's frustrating him. But he had a faith that it was intelligible and that he could learn his way through it. The more that he got into reading, the more he realized that it wasn't that intelligent. And he was pointing to me with this belief. How could it be like that? And I, for the first time in my life, saw the code through the mental lens, through the eyes and mind of a bright, verbally dexterous child. And it just blew me away. I couldn't believe it either. How could that be? How could it be such a mess of confusions? How could it be so erratic and inconsistent? So I developed a system at the time, which I later would call orchestrated reading, in which basically I cued him. I developed a movement of my pencil tip so that while he was reading along, I could just tap my pencil over every time his voice was reading and he started to stumble, I could touch my fingertip over the word, and in the way that I did it, I could double tap it for when a letter was making its full-blown letter name sound, or scratch it out when it was silent. I did come up with a couple of small movements like that reduced the amount of confusion, that gave him cues to disambiguate, to recognize the underlying letter sound patterns that were in the word. And within a matter of a week, he just took off like a rocket. And at the time, I wrote a paper about this called Training Wheels for Literacy. This is 1990. And I circulated it with a number of, scholars and scientists and teachers. And pretty much they all thought I was from Mars. And so I went on with my learning work and developing Apple work and talks and what have you. And it was a whole 10 years later when my daughter comes along, 9 years later, when my daughter comes along and she says,
"It's like killing me, putting bow and arrows in me when I go to school. They just send home books. They don't teach how to read."
I was stunned. The difference is that whereas my son had showed me the confusion, my daughter was showing me the confusion and the shame. Despite being this incredibly bright, sensitive, heartful child, she couldn't help but feel like there was something really wrong with her. She had been diagnosed with an auditory memory processing deficit, which meant that she'd decode something, then encounter that same word a paragraph later and have to do it all over again, right? So she was having the problem of confusion magnified by the auditory processing problem, but they both led to a bigger problem, which was the shame. And I started to watch her just die on the vine. Well, one day she came back from a school and we went off to a garage sale. And while at the garage sale, I'm off of one part of the sale and she comes up to me with a book in her hand. And I go, "Wow." She said, "Would you read this to me, Daddy?" And I said, "Okay." And this is the first page of it, the very first words in it.
Some people there are who, being grown, forget the horrible task of learning to read. It is perhaps the greatest single effort that the human undertakes.
And he must do it as a child. It goes on and on and on. The Steinbeck, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, had enormous problems with reading when he was a child, and it just totally warped his life. And so when he saw it happen in his kids. Anyway, the point of it is when her bringing that book was kind of like a message from the universe, however you want to put that. And I stopped my general learning work and decided to go into the reading work. And that's what led to the Children of the Code project, those quotes that I shared with the beginning. And then over the course of the Children of the Code project, just to give you a little preview of this, we interviewed these 1,000 people and broke it into 130 videos that dealt with everything that you can imagine about reading, from the various dimensions of the crisis, the emotional danger that children are in, the social danger, how it relates to social danger, the collective cost to democracy, to the economy, the national learning disability that it represents, the academic damage, why reading matters to the cognitive infrastructure of the brain, on and on and on. We looked at the various reasons why reading is so difficult, from innate variations to parental differences, to preschools, to exposure to print, non-English speaking backgrounds, to the colleges of education, to dysteachia, to the switch to reading to learn, to the fact that kids can't help but blame themselves, which triggers the shame. Right, to the various dimensions of reading readiness, the things that are required in order for a brain to be ready to take on the challenge, from epigenetics to the early boot up of the brain, and to the emotional and cognitive relationship. All these things are part of the video collection of Children of the Code. To shame, one of the biggest things and one of the least understood things, in the sense that for most of the kids that struggle with reading past 4th grade, their problem isn't the struggle with reading at the reading mechanics level so much anymore. I mean, it is, it's still a big part of our problem, but it's overlaid by the shame. They now have developed an emotional reflexive response to how bad it feels to be in that confused state that their emotional intelligence doesn't want to have. They want to get out of there. Right? They want to leave the scene. So we looked at shame. We looked, if I was to do a thing on shame, it would take more time than I have today, just on that one piece of it. It's so important, because shame isn't just an unfortunate side issue. Isn't it terrible that Johnny or Susie's feeling shame? But shame is a fundamentally cognitive disentraining phenomena. When children experience shame in relation to reading, it makes reading more difficult. Therefore, more difficult it is, the harder it is, the less good at it they are, the more they feel ashamed. The more they feel ashamed, the harder it is to do it, and a downward spiral ensues. This is really important to understand. So we looked at what is reading and came up with the notion that, in fact, reading is an artificially inseminated language experience, a code informed and instructed of fabrication by the brain to create an experience of language. So Children of the Code did this whole spectrum, including brain science, cognitive science, language science, all these different dimensions that stretched from, again, the beginnings of writing all the way through to the state of reading in America. So there are many dimensions to it. The thing that I want to draw attention to now is the relationship between the code and the confusion that lies at the heart of it. Ultimately, the brain's challenge, the more that you go into the brain challenge and you look at phonemic differentiation and letters and sounds and spelling patterns and all these various things that are going on, at the heart of it, at the very heart of it, at the initial phase of getting up to reading, so that word recognition is as transparent as listening to a word, right? To see a word and be able to read it is as transparent as listening, is that it's taking the brain too much time to work through the confusion before it stutters and breaks down. And that the more that it stutters and breaks down, the more that that triggers the shame, the more that it triggers the shame, the more the shame distracts the brain from being able to read, et cetera, right? So the purpose of instruction is to kind of compensate for the confusion in the code, lead people through the confusion in the code so that they can get the Matthew effect of having sufficient success in word recognition and working through the code, that they get this upward spiral, right? So there are many different factors, but ultimately you could say that the reading conversation boils down to how well is a child ready for the challenge, right? Which is their early life learning trajectory in terms of emotional resilience, vocabulary background, processing speed, other variables, right? There's the implicit inherent confusion that's in the code that instruction tries to create a pathway through, and all that has to happen within a certain window of time from the time the child starts, or the child's going to shame out, right? And the shame is going to make the whole thing worse, right? Now, back to the assumption that I started with. The assumption that we're going to talk about is the assumption that we have to read with static print. And the reason that that's important is brought out in many different ways. And this is one way that hopefully all of you can relate to.
We can say essentially from the brain's point of view that learning to read consists first in recognizing the letters and how they combine into written words, and second, connecting them to these systems coding for speech sounds and for meaning. The speed of learning is not something so easy to determine because it varies depending on the language. And there is beautiful research showing that Italian, for instance, can be learned in 3 months because it's a completely regular system. Every letter corresponds to a sound. English is probably the world's worst alphabetic language. I'm sorry to say, that's the one we choose, because there are many irregularities, and it is known that children will need 2 more years to achieve the same level as in Italian or in other regular languages. So, but typically, even in English, after 3 years of training, in grade 3, children should be readers. And there is no reason for a pedagogy not to achieve success in reading in 1 year for regular languages.
So everything that we currently have to teach to work around to get kids up to speed with reading are compensations for the fact that the code itself is so confusing. Just as he just said, right? To the extent that we were dealing with Spanish, we were dealing with Italian, we're dealing with more orthographically simplistic and transparent orthographies. The challenge of learning to read is entirely different. We have to do all of this work that we're doing because of the complexity that's in the code. Now, the point that I want to bring up is that to the extent that the reading science that we've been talking about, the experts that we've been hearing at the conference, every one of them share the assumption that the word itself that the child is reading is static and can't in and of itself help the child learn to read. Now, let me, oops, there we go. Let me take a perpendicular pause for a moment and to a different direction real quick. Can you imagine children, have you ever heard of a child that gave up on learning to talk? Or feed themselves? Or give up on walking? Said walking's too much trouble? Or using the toilet? That's because until children learn otherwise, and they do learn otherwise, and that's the challenge of our time, children have an innate faith and trust in their capacity for learning. it's not something that they come to believe in. It's something that they can't help but believe in. It doesn't even occur to them that they couldn't learn their way through these things, right? Now, imagine how different things would be for them if, rather than letting them learn to walk, we tried to teach them to have a knowledge-based mental model of how to walk. Imagine instead of them learning to talk naturally, we tried to insist that they learn all kinds of abstract science about talking as a mediating cognitive structure to learning to talk. It'd be absurd, right? They couldn't do it. And yet this is exactly what we're doing when it comes to reading. I'm jumping a second here. I want to show you something else. Remember, I showed you this before. Every bit of the current science of reading is based on the fact that you can't do this. You can't just click on a word.
Reading. I N T if ka scientific lol at n ga what a jump language.
So let me explain that a little bit. Remember I told you back in the 90s with my son, he had a problem with being able to work through the confusion, and I developed a way to help him through it. Well, that evolved over time into a system that we would today call PQs, which is a series of variations in the appearance of letters that are morphological analogs to the sound they represent. So when a letter makes its full letter name sound, it's bold. When it's silent, it's gray, etc. But we don't have time for me to go into the details of how all that system works. For anybody that's interested, I can send you information on how that works. We originally did this in a paper-based trial. We used a system like this.
I looked out the front window. I saw two shiny motorcycles pull up in the driveway.
Just require signing a contract to return him to his breeder if things did not work out. Bo enrolled with Kid.
So the consequence of this was a study conducted by Bellarmine University showed significant large gains over Bellarmine University's own reading instructional program when kids used this training wheels paper-based technology. What we did over time was develop this into two different forms of online technology. One, a safety web, and one, training wheels. The safety web is the more important one. As you know, most of the kids from 4th grade to 12th grade, they're past the point that we're giving them explicit reading instructions. They're kind of on their own. So what we did was develop a safety web that would underlie any text in any environment and provide them this instantaneous support system. So take, for example, news for kids.
If lol yeah n zip millions.
Or today's US Day Today magazine. That, by the way, that what you're looking at is the time that it's taking the system to load this. So when it first pops up, what it's doing is it's giving you a visual cueing system to tell you how that word sounds. And if you don't, if that's sufficient, great, you're gone. You're off and running. If it's not, you can click it again and it gives you this animated sound out.
Coronavirus.
So W in there represents what we call Word Explorer. And with this system, you can click that word and get a immediate reference panel that opens up that gets you definitions, root meanings if there are any, and multiple language translations. Non-Polish for that. And as I said, this works across the entire web. So whether you're talking about ReadWorks content, or Wikipedia,
Zip adaptations.
So a super dexterous, quick ability to get support for whatever it is that somebody might need. So again, this is the safety net system. It's designed to underlie any kind of content. It already works by an extension that can be added to your browser and turns every page on the web into an online reading support system that will get this real-time guided pronunciation support for word recognition and this complete reference library, as I mentioned. In addition to the safety net, there's another dimension of this which has to do with helping kids that are still in the beginning phases of reading, which we call training wheels for learning to read. This has a more verbose pop-up system so that when you click on a word, you have to click it, you get one set of clues, click it again, you get another set of clues, click it again, you get a sound out. So depending on the word that you're looking at, it may have multiple levels of cues that rather than giving learners a quick way to just get a reminder like we'd want with a safety net, here we actually want to give them a series of stage scaffold descents into how it is the letters in a word participate in the sound of the word. In addition to the more verbose pop-up system, this has a series of other tools. By the way, this is an environment here with millions of words and thousands of stories that work like this.
They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree.
The same technology can be used to play games that help kids focus on learning different components of the letter sound relationship spectrum. So here we're teaching letter names. So we can click a word.
Name.
Which letter is saying its name?
Sorry, that letter, does not say. Wonderful.
Same thing is true with combines.
You've got your brain in gear. Good for you.
In addition to all kinds of exercise toys like this for learning letter sound relationships through experimental iteration, where they're actually able to listen to a word and then
exactly right.
Click on the letter that corresponds to the sound that we're asking them to pay attention to. We can also embed what we call stop words, stop and learn words. So let's go to silent letters.
Stop on words that
where it'll read to them, but then stop until they click on a word
Rut.
that demonstrates what we want to have demonstrated.
Raw. Reveal.
Wow, how does it do that? In addition to these tools, we have teaching tools like Letterscope. Letterscope allows a teacher to, while working with a classroom, to explore all of the possible relationships that any one letter has with all of the sounds that it makes.
E. Sh. On. Air. Ing. Air. A. War. Or. U.
It's adjustable. You can adjust the scope down so that it works with just kindergarten level words or third grade words or high school words. So you can change the level or the threshold with which of the words that it's working with. There's a series of other tools that teachers can use that include WordScope, which is a tool in which you can type in a word and the first thing you have to do is separate it into segments. And then solve the puzzle of making the right configuration of sounds. This also has all kinds of adjustments for grade levels. There's word families, letter blocks, a number of other tools that we have for teachers for teaching letter sounds that use this same underlying technological model of representing letters and sounds in this way. This technology, let me check my time. This technology can run on virtually everything. It runs on cell phones, it runs on tablets, it runs on laptops, it runs on big computers. It can be used by individuals, it can be used in classrooms, and teachers can use it to project the images of what they're doing, like reading along on a story and stopping on a word and blowing it up, etc., to share with their classroom. Now, the particulars of this, the way that the pop-up looks and the cues that we're using and all of that stuff, those things will all evolve over time. But here's the bottom line in all of this. Just like the science of sails in and of itself didn't lead to the science of steamships, or the science of props, propellers for airplanes didn't lead to jet engines, or the science of how to improve the plague doctor's mask didn't lead to vaccines, or the windmills didn't lead to steam engines, or vacuum tubes to integrated circuits. The technology of reading science today, the way reading science works today, is completely welded to the assumption that words are static objects and that the static objects can't help the children learn to read, and therefore we have to pack into their brains through all these abstract offline training exercises the knowledge and skills that they need when they encounter an unfamiliar word to work out that unfamiliar word and get to word recognition. But we live in an age where the technology has evolved to a point where we can do the fantastic things we're doing now. We're having in this conference. So it's amazing to me that despite 500 years of having reading problems of one form or another, and despite having a world today, a technology today in which the capacity for DNA analysis and for supercomputers and AI and this video conference that's going on, and yet the technology that's probably the most important technology in the world, the technology that we use to teach our children to learn to read with, the technology that most affects their sense of themselves as learners, is a technology that hasn't changed in 500 years. It's a technology of the static orthographic word. And so the future, whether we're talking about the future of online learning, which is going to become all the more in the post-COVID age. We're talking about the individual who's learning on their own as an adult because they've been shamed out all throughout their life over reading. Or we're talking about how to bring children up into this. We're talking about a future now in which the word no longer needs to be static. The word no longer needs to be some fixture that we've got to train the brains of kids to work with, but rather the words of the future, the words in technology will be such that kids can come up to any word that they encounter, whether it's on a phone or a tablet or a computer or a television screen, and touch it and get whatever they need, no matter what their cognitive skill level, no matter what their language background, no matter what their reading skill, no matter what their vocabulary level. They can touch a word and get whatever it is they need to be able to learn their way in to getting through that word and moving on with the learning that they're doing. It's kind of like this. All of the technology, improving the technology of the last stage doesn't do anything against the technology of the next stage. And the next stage of technology is a form of orthography that's no longer static. It's interactive, it's elastic, it's breathing, it's dynamic. Over time, it's actually learning from the children what they need so that it's wrapping around their minds with exactly the kind of support that they need. Okay, back up just a little bit. Back in the 90s, I did a kind of a thought experiment that I'll share with you now. Imagine Apple or Microsoft or Google providing an operating system to the world in which 60% of the users of the operating system had headaches or difficulties or got confused and they couldn't use it. And the market for their operating system was reducing and reducing as people were unable to be able to use it due to the bugs and confusions in their operating system. And that rather than trying to fix their operating system, they focused instead on how to train the brains of the users to work with the operating system with the bugs that it already has. Right? So I called that the alpha fawn analogy, in that in effect, that's really what's been going on. That we're talking about a technology that has been pretty static for almost 500 years, right? And the Children of the Code stuff, which I'll come to give you a slide for at the end of the show, goes through the entire history of this. 500 years of a static technology that we're trying to train our children's brains to be able to relate to. Now, up until recently, we didn't have any choice. But about 30 years ago, we began to have a choice. And the only reason that we continue to insist that our children learn to read with this static technology is that we really don't understand the orthography, the relationship between the orthography and the brain, and the collateral damage to the health of the child's learning that's a consequence of the confusion that it engenders, the unnatural artificial confusion engendered by the reading process and the consequent effect that it has on their future learning. Okay, I think I'm within 2 minutes of my wrap-up time. Is that right, Mike?
Yes, I'm just getting the questions ready to ask you. So give me 1 minute. I was just a little slow to the trigger here. Believe it or not, I got caught up processing some emails.
So while we're talking about that, let me go to this last page. Here we go. These has the URLs for the 4 different sites. Oops. It keeps jumping on me. So the PQ thing is the URL for getting the tool that you can add to your Chrome browser that will turn every page on the web into a system like I've been describing. The MLC, the Magic Ladder, is an environment in which you can go to actually use curated stories, hundreds of stories, dozens of ebooks, millions of words that will allow you to use this full technology right out of the gate with those stories. Children of the Code has 130 plus videos that go into reading from one end to the other, all of which are free. They're also available on a YouTube channel that you can get to from there. And Learning Stewards is the learning environment, or the website about learning that talks about the various dimensions of learning and the need for improving how we all behave as stewards of the health of our children's learning.
Do you have the capability to translate whole documents into this language code? This would be very beneficial for ease of use.
Yeah. You mean translate from different languages? There's a number of tools that are already out there that will translate into any language into any language. Once it's in English, this thing will work with any document. So a Google document, we actually have a feature which I didn't show on our main site where you can drop a PDF into a Google Drive and then open it with everything in the PDF working this way.
So obviously it has the capability to translate whole documents.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It says, how do we access these add-ons?
This PQ, are they able to see my screen share right now?
Yes.
Okay. The thing with the PQ bulb, that's the place to go to access just the add-on that will add on to your Chrome browser. You can also get it from any of the other sites, but that's the direct access.
Deb says, I love this tool. What is the vision for it? Is the goal for this tool to help students to eventually be able to read without this tool? Or do you have most students?
Absolutely. That's why we call it a safety net, right? This thing deals with leveled instruction. It deals with vocabulary compensation. It deals with reading skill compensation. It deals with differentiated instruction, but it puts the agency of control for all of that in the child's hands, right? So the child can get just what they need as much as they need. And the point is, over time, the more they use it, the less they need it. It's giving them a way to exercise their awareness of and recognition of letter sound patterns that is not static and offline. The way we teach today is we're kind of cramming it into their brain offline from their separate learning. And most of the time that a child is building up their reading skills, they're alone. They're off by themselves, right? There's not a teacher, there's not a guide, there's not somebody there one-on-one with them. They're by themselves. So this is meeting them right on the edge of their live interaction with words and giving them the instructional support to learn how to recognize the way letters and sounds work inside of words.
Do you have research on how long it takes for students to normalize their reading skills so they can read static print?
Not in the empirical sense. As I showed you earlier, a study was done using the paper-based version of this that showed really remarkable gains. And to our knowledge, those gains made it possible for those kids to transition into regular static orthography. Again, I'm not saying that kids don't need to learn to read, don't need to be able to read static orthography. Of course they do. But there's nothing except centuries of inertia that says we got to teach them that way. When you look at the cost of our reading failure, the hundreds of billions of dollars, which is well documented in Children of the Code, and you look at the collateral damage, the cost of a $30 reading appliance during the beginning and remedial stages, if needed, of reading so that they can get this kind of live support is a no-brainer. So this is for example, if you followed Engelman's work on the number, or other people's work on the number of exposures it takes for a word to become a sight word, an automatic sight word, not a sight word by visual memory in the whole language sense, but a sight word on the other side of having numerous times worked it out. then this system will be neurologically radically more efficient than the way that we teach reading now.
What reading levels is the training wheels for?
Any level at all. In other words, you can use this with anybody that can learn the basic steps of the tool, which are anytime you open up a page. So this is the Magic Ladder universe. So if we go to an ebook, and said there's a great number of them, and click on a story. So there's all these options. They can have it read to them with a little green highlighter.
One day a little rabbit was running
They can
along.
have it read to them
One
slowly.
day
While the
little
code's being
rabbit
revealed
was
as it's read to
running
them.
along on the sand,
can click on a
lippity,
word.
lippity, when he saw L a fa a na ta elephant.
So once a child's developed to a point where they've got the mechanical dexterity, the physical dexterity to be able to click on a word, this thing can take over and help them at every level, including, now, this particular story, notice when I click on this, there's no word explore. We want to keep certain things, for younger children, we want to stop them from extraneously exploring, right? So, but if we go to more complex texts, like, let's take 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So go down here. So Superior. Here, notice I've got the word explorer. I can click that word and immediately get all these supports. So it kind of regulates according to age and complexity. But the only thing somebody needs to be able to know is every time they encounter a word that they don't recognize, it doesn't immediately pop to mind, just click it. If the first version of its display with all it's telling you is that all these letters are their common sound except that E, right? If we come back to a word like this where there's a lot of variation, that may be enough. They see that the P's making a full-blown sound, that's the sound, etc. They get a sense of that. They read it, they move on. If they don't, they click it and hear it.
S.
So there's not much reading the reading instruction is simply click when you don't understand until you do. And it can work with any age group. So there's from the content that we have here to show you one other thing.
Another question aligned with this says, I love this tool for support. Is the goal for this tool to help students to eventually be able to read without this tool?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the point is that's why I call it training wheels and a safety net, right? It's not meant to replace the fact that ultimately we're going to want kids to be able to read on paper. But during the beginning phase of their learning to read, and for those that are struggling, this is an environment that can act like training wheels to reduce the complexity and the danger and the shame and all of that of getting up to speed and running autonomously in their reading. As a training wheels level. And then for those that are struggling on the, older third, fourth grade where formal reading instruction has dropped away and they're kind of on their own, now this is a safety net that sits underneath instructional content. So if we go back to here, for example, David,
I like the way you describe it as training wheels. It's there for support.
Right, but this can be applied to
different ways.
So let's take a physics course.
The nice thing, David, is how expensive this is.
Yeah, well, that's one thing. The whole point is to make this thing common, right? Make this just the way the web works.
It's free. Somebody said they couldn't get the PQ link to work. Is there a longer link instead of the bit one?
Hang on a minute. Yeah. First of all, the link to do this is on every page of just every one of my sites. But I'm going to send this off via the chat feature if I can.
Sure.
see. Where is the chat?
Should be at the bottom.
I see Q&A. I don't see chat.
I saw that. I saw that Dustin, perhaps. Dustin Bolton sent something out.
Oh, did he? Okay.
Yeah. So maybe he could just send it out to everyone on the chat feature. He's on the chat. Dustin, if you're out there. And then another question here is, has research been done on improvements to reading skills as a result of using PQ or Magic Ladder?
As I mentioned, a Bellarmine study was done. Now, this was done on a paper-based version of this. Can you still see my screen?
Yeah, I can see your screen.
Okay. So this was a two different small groups of students, but a gold standard, data matched set, in which kids that were being trained or that were going through a Bellarmine study, a Bellarmine training exercise with teachers about how to teach reading, were moving through the class, and we pulled out students from them and added to them this tool, used this tool to help them. And again, if you think about, if you've ever paid attention to a struggling reader's articulation stream, if you ever listened to the hesitation, starts and stops that you hear in their voice when they're reading, right? Those starts and stops directly correspond to their mind getting lost in a bog of confusion as they hit a letter sound pattern, and they stop their ability to make word recognition. So the whole point of the cues in the paper-based version was to reduce that confusion, and it did, right? What we've done since then with the pop-up being able to be applied to any online text is of a different order. But it's the same basic idea, it's just more powerful.
Would you recommend this to parents to use with their struggling readers over the summer?
Absolutely, yeah. One of the things that I like as a model for this is for kids, teachers and parents can read to their kids, and when they encounter a word that they think is interesting and illustrative, they can just touch it and the word will pop up and then go through its animations, right? So they can do that a few times to get their kids familiar with this kind of touch and learn approach, and then hand whatever the book or the material is over to the children and watch them for a few minutes, and they'll take off on their own. I mean, this is really, you look at what kids are doing with video games at an even earlier age. Go to the mall and you see 2-year-olds in strollers playing on games on telephones, right? This is super simple. This makes learning to read super simple, easier than most of the games they're playing.
The idea of marking up text to support students in knowing how the letter sounds are behaving looks similar to reading mastery. Is this related in any way?
No, it's kind of a parallel effort. This is Engelman, et cetera, right? And one of the differences is that in the way that we approached the early paper-based version of PQs was that we weren't talking about something where you had to print some book in some custom special way in order to have various characters. We were able to take any text, and we can still do that today, take any text and in a matter of minutes convert every letter and every word into this form. So this is a more universal form of text markup, you might say. There's a very simple set, and for those that are interested in that, email me after the conference. I can send them to a page that explains how these markups work. But basically, they're morphic analogs of the sounds they represent. So rather than being diacritical marks that require another kind of cognitive interpretive loop in order to use, when a letter is stretched out in sound, it's stretched out visually. When it's making a higher sound or a lower sound, it's higher or lower. When it's silent, it's grayed out. So it's still there. You recognize it's there, so that the orthographic mapping pattern work's still there. But it disappears from, you immediately know that you're not supposed to hear that sound when you look at that word. And when it's saying its letter name, it's fully bold. It's bright, right? So there's a series of variations in the appearance of letters that map in a very simplistic and analogical way to the difference in sound that they're cueing.
Since we just had Nancy Mather up speaking about dyslexic children, is there any research of using any of these tools with dyslexic children?
Research, no. Anecdotal evidence of people using it with great success, yes.
Okay. What are your long-term goals for interactive orthography?
I want this to become just the way every online word works, full stop. So whether you're on a phone or your tablet or computer or television, whether you're perusing a news article or it's just text accompanying a video you're watching, no matter what it is, if the text is online, then in the future we're going to be able to touch that text and get whatever support we need, no matter who we are, no matter what our language background is, no matter what our reading skill is, no matter what our understanding of the content knowledge base is, and get whatever we need to learn our way on from there. So this is the beginnings of a transformation in the relationship between humans and text, in which the text, instead of being static and us having to wrap ourselves around it, is becoming alive and dynamic and elastic and supportive of whatever anybody needs to learn.
When students use this tool, do you see that they are able to answer comprehension questions with success after the reading?
Yeah, in fact, most of the lessons that we have inside of the Magic Ladder library have comprehension questions in them that have, where the questions themselves can be read, or they can use this tool to help them with, and that they can select, the right multiple choice answer to, et cetera. And all the evidence is that, yeah, it definitely helps them. I mean, this thing is taking away the shame and it's taking away the confusion, right? Which are the two bottlenecks, the things that cause most kids trouble with reading, is the unnatural confusion and the emotional response they have to that confusion. This deals with both of them.
Is that the mind shame you referred to earlier?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier on, when children develop a shame response, I mean, first of all, they can't help but blame themselves for not being good at this. We all unintentionally conspire to create the conditions in which children who struggle for a long period of time with reading blame themselves for it. They think there's something wrong with them. The more that they blame themselves, the quicker and easier it is for them to shame themselves whenever they encounter something that causes this confusion. So once kids start to associate confusion and blame with "I'm not good enough," which happens en masse, then that triggers the shame. And once the shame happens, their attention and their emotional energy is in the shame, and it's depleting their capacity, just like the simple view of reading says about comprehension and decoding. If their brain is preoccupied or occupied with shame, then it's diminishing their capacity for paying attention to, both at the decoding and the comprehension level, what they're reading. So mind shame is what happens when all of this, concretizes in people, and they start to become ashamed of themselves as learners. When they become learning disabled because they want to avoid the confusion in the world because of how bad it makes them feel about themselves. So I call it mind shame, and I think it's the #1 learning disability in the human species.
Well, I must admit to you that I've heard that from children, and I've actually heard that from adults who grew up not being able to learn how to read, that they thought their brain wasn't working right. They actually internalized the pain as there's something wrong with them, to the point where I have heard stories, I haven't witnessed them personally and live, but about children wanting to take their own life because they felt different. They didn't feel whole. They felt less than all the kids. And sometimes they were shamed by the kids about being dumb because maybe a teacher had asked them to read out loud and they couldn't. And
Right. The Children of the Code is full of interviews with kids, as you know well, that describe these various things, including talking to a mom whose child hung himself at school to make a sign of all of this to the school, right? It's just horrible that the vast majority of our children grow up to various degrees feeling ashamed of their mind because of a confusion engendered by an archaic technological artifact that we're not paying enough attention to. We're busy trying to develop a science for how to teach it.
Yeah, I'm sorry, David. I think most of the people on the call are drinking the same Kool-Aid, that they believe in the science and they're trying to get out from underneath, at least as I'm reading the chat questions along the last couple of days is, what am I going to do with my district? They're in a balanced approach to literacy with junky assessments or no assessments. How do I get out of this hole? And so I think it might be preaching to the choir. I love that you offer all these tools for free, David, that you're out trying to bend the curve, so to speak, of trying to get us to think outside the box and use tools that could very much help and, as you said, used as training wheels. So I really appreciate what you brought to us. Again, another straight talk by an expert. And I thank everyone for their time. I thank you for your time, David.
Thank you, Mike, and thank everybody at Step by Step. It's really been an honor and a pleasure, and I appreciate it very much.
Oh, you're very welcome.